The Song of Solomon, a very unusual book in the Bible. Unlike any of the other books, it's like the poetry books more than any others because it's written by Solomon in poetic form, as also were the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And although the subject matter is entirely different, while Proverbs and Ecclesiastes give us wisdom and are therefore called wisdom literature, the Song of Solomon is more of a love song. We're told in 1 Kings chapter 4 that Solomon, in his lifetime, wrote about 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. In the Hebrew, the name of this book is called Solomon's Song of Songs. And that means that it's his favorite of his songs that he wrote. It is a really excellent song, although when you read it in the King James Version, it is confusing. It can be confusing at least because it is written in a drama form where there is more than one speaker. And the King James Version, for example, does not notify the reader when there's a change of speakers. This change is evident in the Hebrew many times by the fact that the pronouns, he and she and so forth, and the nouns also, like the noun my beloved, has a masculine and a feminine form. These don't come out in the English. And to help English readers, many of the modern translations have broken this up into sections where they have a title. I don't know which translations do and don't do this. I think most new translations do, that they have sort of a subtitle over each verse or section of verses where there's a change of speaker. So they'll say the bride speaks, or the daughters of Jerusalem speak, or the bridegroom speaks, or something like that. And I will try to, since we're using the King James and it doesn't make those divisions for us, I will introduce those divisions while we go through it so that you can sort of follow what is being said by whom. Now, it is not always clear, and there are some passages where it is debatable who is speaking. But I'm going to give you what I think is a reasonable rendition of the book. The book is, of course, very explicit with reference to sexual love. It is a book about a marriage. And it is also a book about the courtship prior to that marriage. And it is not written up in a chronological order. It is written up in a series of 7 idyls, as they are called. That would be spelled I-D-Y-L, idyll. An idyll is a short song, usually in a pastoral setting, that is having to do with pastoral life, the life of shepherds and farmers and people like that. And an idyll usually takes commonplace things of life and gives them sort of a tinge of romance. And there are 7 of these individual idylls. And the 7 of them taken together make the book of Song of Solomon. And they do not divide up by the chapter divisions. The chapter divisions do not indicate at all when there's a change in this, and I will point it out when we get to it. But each one of them presents a different scene. Now, these scenes do not, as I said, put the story to us in chronological order. For instance, they don't start with the meeting of the bride and bridegroom when they first met and then move through their courtship and then end up with the wedding. It starts, in fact, in the first idyll with the wedding itself. And then from there, it kind of flashes back and reminisces about different points in their past that led up to their wedding. It does talk about the time they first met, but not immediately. That comes up rather late in the book. It talks about periods of their courtship, and so that's another reason why it could be confusing. If you read it in the English version, it can be very confusing because you don't know who's speaking for the most part when you're reading it, and you don't know if you don't know the story, then of course the lack of chronological order just makes it sound like a series of miscellaneous statements that lovers might make to each other in flowery and flamboyant language. In fact, so explicit are some of the verses that the Jews did not permit their children to read this book until they were 18 years old. The Jews didn't allow children to read this book. It was like X-rated. But it really, though it definitely deals with sexual subjects, it deals with pure subjects because it's largely the story of a man and his bride. And as such, it has, I believe, typological value. That is, it is a type. This was recognized by the Jews even before Christ and has generally been recognized by Christians throughout history. And there would be some who would dispute this. Some would say there's no typological value at all. It's just a picture of marital love. It's a beautiful, explicit picture of two people in love, and love is a sacred thing, and it's a good thing, and that's the value of the book. It just shows us how people can really get off on being in love. And it does that for sure. But I do believe the Jews were correct, and that Christians throughout history have been correct in identifying this as a type of God and Israel as the Jews saw it, or as Christ and the church as Christians have historically seen it. And to support this view, among other things, is the fact that Solomon is, in some senses, a type of Christ elsewhere. In the prophecy given to David about the time that he wanted to build the temple, and Nathan the prophet said, "No, God will not permit you to build the temple." He said, "However, a son of yours who shall proceed out of your own loins shall sit on your throne in your stead, and he shall build a house unto my name, and I will establish his kingdom forever." There's a sense in which Solomon fulfilled that. He was a son of David, sat on his throne after him, and built the temple, built a house unto his name. But there's another sense in which that prophecy looks forward to Christ. Also a son of David, also sits at David's throne now, also built the house, which is the church, and it is certainly in Jesus and not in Solomon that the throne was established forever. So you can see that Solomon was a partial fulfillment or a type of the ultimate fulfillment of that prophecy. He was a type of Christ. And there may be other senses in which we could see Solomon as a type of Christ. And this Song of Solomon may be one of those places, and I believe it is. Now, the storyline, again, even once it is recognized that there are various speakers, and once you're able to identify who the speakers are, not all interpreters are in agreement as to what the story is. One very common interpretation is that it's a story about a young girl and two men who loved her. She was a young shepherd girl of low birth, a common peasant, a keeper of vineyards and of sheep with her brothers, and that she had a boyfriend who was also a shepherd, and that he loved her and he hoped for her to marry him. But that there was another man that came into her life, and that was King Solomon, who came and saw her and was taken by her beauty and sought to woo her away from the shepherd. And that ultimately, according to this interpretation, she resisted the overtures of the king and married the shepherd. Now, I don't see, now that's an interesting storyline, and there definitely is a shepherd man in this, and there also is King Solomon. And so it would appear at first glance that there are two men involved in this story, and those who see it this way say, this is a picture of the church, the young woman, and her shepherd boy friend or lover or whatever he was to her is like Christ, the good shepherd. Solomon, the king, with all of his regalia and overtures that he makes to sweep her off her feet with wealth and glamour and so forth, represents the world to these people, and therefore it portrays a picture of the wooing of the world trying to woo the church away from Christ, and that she finally makes her decision for Christ. Now, that makes an interesting story, and it makes an interesting type for us, and if that were the true meaning of the story, then that would make an interesting picture of Christ and the church and the world in conflict. However, I don't agree with that. For one thing, it seems evident as you read the book that the woman involved did marry Solomon. And that seems clear from the very fact that he wrote this song about her. It doesn't seem that if he lost her in the end, he'd still write this song about his affair or his love for her. And it would appear as though, in fact, she is at his wedding feast, at his banqueting table in the first idyll. And so I don't believe that interpretation is the correct one. I don't believe there are two male figures as stars of this drama at all. I'll tell you what I believe is the interpretation, and this is not original with me. This is just an alternative that has been held by other Christians besides the one I just gave you, and I believe it's the correct one. It can't be proven, but you'll see that if you have this general framework of the story in mind, that everything in the book seems to fit it. And it also presents an interesting type of Christ in the church. In this proposed story, Solomon, the king, makes a visit to one of his many vineyards that belongs to him, one that he's never been to before. This one is in Lebanon. And he goes with his kingly retinue to Lebanon to look at some of his holdings. And while he is there, he sees for the first time a young girl who along with her brothers is a keeper of the vineyard. And she's absolutely ravishing. She's beautiful. He's immediately smitten when he sees her, and he calls out to her to come over to him so that he can have a better look. And she's very modest and very coy, and she runs away in embarrassment, and she hides herself from him. And so he goes about his business and goes back to Jerusalem, to his home. Later, he comes back disguised as a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he does not intimidate her. She doesn't know that this is the King Solomon, and he woos her, and he courts her, and he wins her heart, and then he disappears again. And then she's all grieved because she can't find him, and she wonders where he's gone, and she has dreams about it that torment her, about how maybe she offended him. Now, will she ever find him again? And then he appears a third time in her life, again as Solomon, again as the king in his royal regalia, and she recognizes him as her shepherd lover, and he proposes marriage to her. She now recognizes he is the king. She accepts the proposal, and they marry. And then, at the end of this, after they've been married for some time, she is somewhat jealous. This is clear in the last idyll. She talks about how jealousy is cruel as the grave and so forth, and she's burning up with jealousy. You can hardly blame the girl. The man had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And at the time this was written, he had 60 wives and 80 concubines, so he was just starting to get them. He was starting to collect them. And so at the time he married her, he had 60 wives. He added several hundred more in the time after he married her, and you could imagine why she might feel a little jealous. And so after they've been married for some time, she expresses her torment about this matter of her jealousy and asks, do you still love me like before? Am I still special? And they go back. She expresses her homesickness for her humble home in Lebanon, and so he takes her back to Lebanon, back to the vineyard where they first met, and they have a renewal of vows, as it were, a renewal of love on that occasion. So, if that is the story, as I said, everything in the book seems to fit that, and it also makes an interesting picture of Christ and the church, because, and Israel, for that matter. It means the Jews were correct also as seeing Israel in the picture. The woman, of course, is, in this case, Israel. Solomon represents God. He does not represent the world in this particular view of the book. He represents God, who first introduced himself to Israel at Mount Sinai. And in all his power and glory and the earthquake and the smoke and the flames of fire, Israel shrunk back in terror from him. And they were not attracted to him, although they feared him, and in a sense, they entered into covenant with him. They belonged to him, but they were not drawn to him by this show of his splendor. And so later in history, he comes to them as a humble shepherd. Now, Jesus, of course, was not literally a shepherd by profession, but he did describe himself as a good shepherd, and he came in a humble manner, in humble dress, as though in disguise, really. He was God in the guise of human flesh, in literal human flesh. And there he won the bride, the remnant of Israel who would believe. And then he left again. And we live during that time of his absence, but he will return again in all his regal splendor to claim his bride. And so this is the picture of the story as I personally understand it. You may end up with a different interpretation. You might already have a different interpretation. Of course, you're welcome to it. This is the kind of thing where there is some room for people to interpret things differently. But this is the assumption upon which I will approach the book, that this is the story. Solomon intimidates the girl the first time he meets her by his overwhelming magnificence, and so he comes back in a humbler form, disguised as a shepherd, wins her heart, disappears again, and then returns and manifests himself to her as the great king, and she suddenly realizes this man that she's fallen in love with is the king of the whole Middle East, and now she accepts his proposal. And right, Solomon is a type of Christ. Mm-hmm. Well, not everyone even agrees that this is a type of Christ in the church. There are some who say, as I said earlier, some just see this as a beautiful poem about people in love. And, yeah, I am convinced myself, and that's up to you to decide whether that's a valid thing. I'm convinced that it is a picture of Christ in the church. Now, let me show you how the book is broken down and give you basically where the breakdown is of the 7 individual idylls. The reason I say there are 7 individual idylls is because the scene does seem to change 7 times. And there are a few places where there's a recognizable punctuation in the story. The first of these idylls is chapter 1 and verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 7. I would point out that chapter 2, verse 7 reads like this: I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up, nor awake my love, till he please. Since you've just read the book through recently, you know that this expression comes up 3 times in the book. Each time it is at the end of one of the idylls, although it doesn't come up at the end of all of them. It comes up at the end of 3 of them, and it provides a punctuation and an indication that we've come to the end of one of them in those 3 cases. So, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 7 is the first. And this basically is a picture, the story starts, the scene opens, the curtains are drawn with the bride and her groom on the wedding day. Okay, so it starts out giving us a view of the wedding day. And then it goes back and flashes back, as I said, to various reminiscences of things that happened before. And that in the second idyll is chapter 2, verse 8 through chapter 3, verse 5. Chapter 2, 8, and 3, 5 is the end of that. And you'll find that 3, 5 also says, I charge you, O you daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awake my love till he please. Again, that second idyll ends the same way as the first. That particular poem is the bride reminiscing about the courtship, reminiscing about the time when they were courting. Of course, at her wedding day, she would do that. She'd sit and just remember how this all came about. And then the third idyll, chapter 3, verse 6, through chapter 5, verse 1, is a recollection of the occasion of the betrothal. And this is actually where it actually tells us of Solomon's first meeting her and her running away and being afraid at that time. However, let's see here. I'm sorry, no, this is actually when he came back. I'm sorry, this is after he had been as a shepherd to her, and he comes back to propose to her. I'm sorry, like I said, this is not in chronological order in my opinion, but it's after she's reminisced about the courtship, she reminisces about the betrothal when he actually proposed marriage to her and her acceptance of it. That's what the third idyll is, chapter 3, verse 6 through chapter 5, verse 1. The fourth is chapter 5, verse 2 through 6, 3. That is through chapter 6, verse 3. This is where the bride relates a troubled dream she had. Apparently it was a dream. She said, I slept, but my heart was awake, which seems to be a way of saying she was physically asleep, but in her heart, that is in her consciousness, she was dreaming. There was something happening. And she dreams about how her lover came to the door. She was already gone to bed. He wanted to come in, but she didn't want to get out of bed and get her feet dirty. And so she didn't come, and while she waited, he disappeared from the door, and she changed her mind, ran after him, and couldn't find him. And she was troubled by this. This, again, may not have been an actual occurrence in the story, but rather it's a dream she's having. It may have symbolic value. It may be since after the shepherd disappeared from her life, she wonders, did I offend him? And these concerns are symbolically brought up. I'm sure Sigmund Freud would have a way of connecting these things with her fears that maybe she's delayed too long, maybe she did something to offend him, and now she's lost her chance. And this dream is related in the fourth idyll, chapter 5, verse 2 through chapter 6, verse 3. The fifth one, then, is the king's meditation on his bride. In the second idyll, she was reminiscing about the courtship. In the fifth, the king is himself meditating on his bride, describing how beautiful she is and what she does to his heart when he sees her and so forth and smells her. The sixth idyll is where we see the bride longing again for her home in Lebanon. It's a very short one, chapter 7, verse 11, through chapter 8, verse 4. She wants to go see her family and her home and so forth. She's kind of homesick. And the seventh idyll is the remainder of chapter 8, 5 through 14. And that is where they actually renew their vows, renew their love, their commitment to each other at her home in Lebanon. All right, now that is how I believe the story is laid out. Again, it may seem a bit artificial to have told the story as I put it together, and maybe there is a sense in which it is, but in a sense, since we can't take the thing chronologically and make sense of it, we have to artificially reconstruct the story as best we can, and then try to see how the different parts fit to it. And the construction of the story as I've given it to you, I believe, is the most consistent with the material. I've read some other interpretations that didn't seem to fit as well to my mind. The seventh was verses 5 through 14 of chapter 8. The renewal of their love at Lebanon, in the original vineyard where they first met. Okay, we'll start, and what I'll have to do is tell you when there's a change of speakers. Sometimes the speaker will change 2 or 3 times within a single verse, and that, of course, makes things a bit confusing. There is, besides the woman and the man, there are other speakers who interject from time to time a statement. The most frequent of these are the women called the daughters of Jerusalem. They are mentioned, they are identified as the daughters of Jerusalem a number of times, and they speak up sort of as a chorus. They appear to be like the bridesmaids at the wedding, and from time to time they interject something to kind of just carry the story along, or to inquire of the bride why she thinks this way about her guy, and gives her a chance to expound on his virtues and so forth. And so the daughters of Jerusalem pipe up once in a while into the story. And then there's a few occasions where the bride's brothers have something to say, and they stick something in once in a while, just twice, I think. But so mainly we have dialogue between the woman and the man, between Solomon and the woman, and occasionally reference to things that were said by the daughters of Jerusalem or the brothers of the bride. I might just say this, that it is impossible for us to identify who the woman is. We know the man is Solomon because his name is given several times in the book. The woman's name is not given, and we don't even know the names of any of Solomon's wives anyway, but she is called Shulamite. In chapter 6 and verse 13, she is referred to as a Shulamite. And the meaning of the word Shulamite is not certain. Shulamite in the Hebrew is very close to the name Solomon. And it is thought that it might even be just a feminine form of the name Solomon, which would mean Solomon's woman, or one of Solomon's girls, one of the Solomonites, a Shulamite. And that is a possibility, that it doesn't refer to her nationality, but simply the fact that she's a woman that belongs to Solomon. On the other hand, it has been suggested by others that Shulamite, if you had exchanged the L for an N, you'd have Shunammite. And in some Hebrew words, an L and an N can be interchanged without changing the meaning of the word. And it is possible that we should see her as a Shunammite. If that is the case, it brings a point of interest to us, because we remember there was one girl in the Bible who was called a Shunammite, and that was Abishag. When David was old and was dying, and his body could not generate heat any longer, they would heap blankets upon him, and he still couldn't be warm. And so they found the most beautiful woman in the kingdom and brought her to David to lie with him in bed and keep him warm. The Bible specifically says he never had sexual intercourse with her, but she simply lay in bed with him and kept him warm. And then, when he died, of course, Solomon became king. And Adonijah, another son of David, wanted to be king, and of course his purposes were thwarted, and Solomon granted an amnesty if he would behave himself. But then Adonijah came and asked if he could marry Abishag, the Shunammite, and Solomon said, "You dirty dog," and he had him killed. Now, why did he have him killed? Well, it would appear from Solomon's statements on the occasion that he saw this as a political move, that it was ordinarily understood that the man who has the former king's concubines and wives is the new king, and so that for him to obtain the Shunammite girl, Abishag, would give him a political wedge there and give him some kind of direct claim to the throne somewhere down the line if Solomon fell, under assassination or something like that. So Solomon, killed him because he saw it as an attempt to grab the throne. But it is not impossible that Solomon may have also been in love with the girl himself and resented the fact that his half-brother wanted to take her. Since it is said that she was chosen out of all the women in the kingdom for her beauty, and since the woman in this chapter, in Song of Solomon, is described as the most beautiful woman in the world, there may be some argument that this Shulamite is actually the Shunammite Abishag, and that Solomon was in love with her. However, of course, every man says that his girlfriend is the most beautiful woman in the world, so we needn't take those terms all that literally. And it does not appear that, there are some things in this that would not appear to refer to her, unless, I don't know how that could, I'm not sure that it could be her, according to any of the stories that are put together from this book. With her being a shepherd girl or a vine keeper girl and so forth, and these things are said of her, and meeting the king, that it'd be hard to know how to harmonize the story of Abishag as it is given to us briefly in the book of First Kings and this story here. So we might be looking too far for a connection between Abishag and this girl, and Shulamite could just mean a woman of Solomon's. And so we won't make any theories too strongly about this. I will point out, though, before we read this, that I'd like to turn your attention to Psalm 45. Because Psalm 45 was a wedding psalm, and it's not known whose wedding it was that this song was written for, but it was a king who was getting married. And, of course, it would have been one of the kings of Jerusalem, one of the sons of David, and it is a possible theory that Psalm 45 is written as a psalm for the occasion of Solomon's wedding, or one of them. And it is a theory, totally unsupportable, but is an interesting theory, that Psalm 45 may have been written about the wedding of Solomon to his favorite wife. If it is the case, it's interesting because this psalm is a messianic psalm and describes the groom as God, and it is quoted in Hebrews chapter 1, this psalm is quoted as about Christ. So if we could say, by any stretch, that Psalm 45 is written on the occasion of the wedding of King Solomon, we know for sure that Solomon then is a type of Christ, because this psalm makes the bridegroom of this occasion a type of Christ. Let me read just briefly the psalm, or parts of it. It begins, "My heart is inditing a good matter. I speak of the things which I have made touching the king." So the king is central in this psalm. "My tongue is the pen of a ready writer." Speaking to the king, "Thou art fairer than the children of men. Grace is poured into thy lips. Therefore God hath blessed thee forever. Gird on thy sword upon thy thigh, O most mighty, with thy glory and thy majesty. And in thy majesty ride prosperously, because of truth and meekness and righteousness, and thy right hand shall teach thee terrible things. Thine arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies, whereby the people fall under thee. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of thy kingdom is a right scepter. Thou lovest righteousness and hatest wickedness. Therefore God, thy God, hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. All thy garments smell of myrrh and aloes and cassia out of the ivory palaces where they have made thee glad." Now, just if I might break in here, verses 6 and 7 are quoted in Hebrews as being about Christ. Yet the writer says he's talking about the king, and it would appear that he's talking about a Jerusalemite king, one who is said very clearly to be a righteous and meek king, which was not true of very many of the subsequent kings of Jerusalem after David. Solomon in his early reign was righteous, however, and therefore he would be a good candidate for this. Now, it says, "All your garments smell of myrrh and aloes and cassia out of the ivory palaces." When we read the Song of Solomon, we'll notice that the girl is talking about the smell of her husband. This is a wedding occasion, as we see as we read on in the Psalm. Verse 9, "King's daughters were among thy honorable women. Among thy right hand did stand upon thy right hand did stand the queen, in gold of Ophir. Hearken, O daughter," apparently speaking to the queen, and consider and incline thine ear, forget also thine own people and thy father's house, so shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is thy Lord, and worship thou him. That is to say, this woman is told to leave her family and to cleave unto her husband, and the king will marry her and desire her beauty and become her lord or husband. And the daughter of Tyre shall be there with a gift, even the rich among the people shall entreat thy favor. The king's daughter is all glorious within. Within probably means within her bridal chambers. Her clothing is of wrought gold. She shall be brought to the king in raiment of needlework. The virgins, the daughters of Jerusalem who come up in Song of Solomon, her companions that follow her shall be brought unto thee. With gladness and rejoicing shall they be brought, and they shall enter into the king's palace. Now, speaking to the king himself, the groom, it says, instead of thy fathers shall be thy children. Because you're going to exchange your relationship with your parents for your relationship with your own family, your own children, whom thou mayest make the princes in all the earth. I will make thy name to be remembered in all generations, therefore shall the people praise thee forever and ever. Now, we could make a lot of this psalm from the messianic aspect, and the bride of Christ and so forth could be brought out of it, but just in light of Song of Solomon and this psalm, we see some very interesting connections. This woman is being brought to him. She is, among his honorable women are king's daughters, it says in verse 9. Solomon probably married, most of his wives were probably the daughters of kings of other nations. They were probably political arrangements, as was very commonly the case in pacts that were made between kings of various nations. Often there'd be the giving of one of their daughters to marry the other in order to make sure there'd be non-aggression relations between them. And probably most of the women that Solomon married were political arrangements rather than arrangements for love's sake. And when it says king's daughters were among thy honorable women, it probably means your harem is made up of king's daughters. But there's one that stands out above them all, and that is the one that's called the queen. And this would, if the man is Solomon, this would be the same girl that Song of Solomon is about. And it talks about how she's brought to him in raiment of needlework. This is at the wedding. It talks about her companions that follow. These would be the bridesmaids. Actually, literally, it should be translated bridesmaids. And so forth. It talks about how the king's fame will be remembered for all generations. There are not many kings of Jerusalem about whom that could be said. Solomon and David being the most famous that ever were. I believe the evidence is at least considerable that Psalm 45 may be related to the same wedding that Song of Solomon is about. And if so, we have a clear picture of the typology of Christ in the church, because in Psalm 45 we have New Testament authority on the fact that that king and that bridegroom is Christ, or represents Christ. So let's come to Song of Solomon with some of these assumptions. It will not hurt us if we're mistaken. It will edify us if we are mistaken or not, but it'll be nice. It's nice to think that we could be right, and I think we are in this approach. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Now, the bride speaks first, and I believe that this is as they're walking outside the house on their way to the wedding banquet. She says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. Because of thy savor of thy good ointments, thy name is as ointment poured forth. Therefore do the virgins love thee. Now, what she is saying here is that his love is better than wine. We see later on in verse 4 it says, we will remember thy love more than wine. Love, of course, she's talking about how she's inebriated with his love. Just as a person gets drunk with wine and swept off their feet by drunkenness, so she feels that way. In fact, a number of times in the book she says, I'm sick of love, or sick with love. And the NIV and others would translate this, I'm faint with love. In other words, she is so affected by this love she has for him that it's as though she's drunk. She can't stand up. She's faint. His love is to her better than wine. It's better than the best wine for making one inebriated and high. So she's high on his love, in others. Now, in comparing his love with wine in these places, we will find later in this chapter and throughout the book, her own body and her own charms she describes as a vineyard. Obviously, if the love between them is like wine, her body, which produces her side of the relationship, is compared to a vineyard producing fruit. And the fruit would, of course, be the grapes that produce wine. So realize that this is set in imagery of a relationship where they're talking about each other like they're like they're a bunch of fruit. I mean, you'll see that to be the case a number of times. And if you can catch the symbolism of what they're saying, they're actually talking quite explicitly about their sexual relationship, but they use language that's a little more discreet, talking about how they get drunk on each other's wine and so forth. Well, in verse 4, I believe she says to him, "Draw me." At this point, I think we should see them at the threshold of the banqueting chamber for the wedding feast, and he has to pick her up and carry her over that threshold according to the Oriental custom. And so she says, "Draw me," or "Bring me in." And at this point, I think the bridesmaids chime in, "We will run after thee." In other words, we're with you. We're following you. And which, of course, means there's not going to be much privacy, but that's sometimes the case in Oriental weddings. But then she says, "The king hath brought me into his chambers." That is, at the first line, "Draw me," is her asking him to carry her into the chambers. Then she says, "He's brought me in." So he crosses over the threshold, and while they're crossing over, the bridesmaids chime in, "We will follow after you. We'll run after you." And then at this point, after she says, "Okay, now we're in the chambers," he's brought me into his chambers, the bridesmaids pipe in again and say, "We will be glad and rejoice in thee. We will remember thy love more than wine." Well, she had already said that his love is better than wine in verse 2. Now the bridesmaids say, "The love between you two is something we'll remember far more than we remember the wine that we drink at your wedding feast." We'll remember that too, by the way, but the love between you is far more striking to us on this occasion than the food and the wine that we're drinking here. And she says then of him, "The upright love thee." I believe that's the bride speaking again. That is, good people love him. That's why she said of him in verse 3, "The virgins love thee." That is to say, all the young girls who are marriageable envy me. They would all love to be in my position marrying you. And the upright people love you. She speaks of him as a person of good reputation. Then she says, and probably at this point he has gone to attend to some bridegroomly business, and she's left alone with the bridesmaids, and she's talking to them. She says, "I am black but comely. O ye daughters of Jerusalem," these are the bridesmaids, "as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked down upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept." Now, in saying, "I am black but comely," she is probably not referring to being a Negro, although she could have been. There were black peoples in that area. But she seems to indicate that she's dark because of the sun shining on her. She's tanned. The sun beat down upon her and tanned her skin because her brothers made her work with them in the vineyard. Now, in our society, dark skin, Americans try to get their skin dark. They lay out in the sun and they go to tanning studios and things like that to try to get dark skin. In that society, to have lily white skin was considered to be really attractive for a woman. And because I guess it was a sign of aristocracy, it meant she didn't have to go out in the sun. Her servants would do it for her. She could stay in the house and be, pampered. And so a woman with really white skin was considered to be desirable in that society. But she's saying, "I am dark, but I'm beautiful anyway." And she says to the bridesmaids, "Don't look down on me because I'm dark. It's not my fault. I was forced by my brothers to go out and work in the vineyard where I was exposed to the sun, and it's, I couldn't help it. I kept the vineyards." But she says, "My own vineyard," at the end of verse 6, "I have not kept." And by this, I think she lapses into symbolism. She says, "I've been keeping vineyards all my life, but my own vineyard," meaning her body, she has not cultivated. She has not sought a husband. She has not, she has not looked out for her own physical desires to be met, but she's spent her time keeping a vineyard with her brothers. Then, I believe, now I think the scene kind of changes, though we're still in the same idyll. I believe, and you could dispute this, but I'm not sure what you could offer in its place. In verses 7 and 8, we have her reminiscing for the moment about when she first met him disguised as a shepherd and began to make inquiries to find out who he was. He was a new guy in town. She didn't recognize him from the other. He was a new shepherd in the area. She asked him where he keeps his flocks. And he answers mysteriously, because of course he's not really a shepherd at all. He's the king in disguise. And he gives her a mysterious answer which only creates a greater mystique and a greater attraction. I think that at this point, as he's out of the room and she's with the bridesmaids talking about, "Yeah, I was out in the vineyards and so forth, and my brothers made me work," as she's reminiscing back to before she met him. She then remembers this occasion when she met him dressed as a shepherd, and she asked him, "Tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest." This apparently is after he's kind of wooed her in shepherd's garb, and she sees him as a shepherd, and she says, and now she's in love with him, but she says, "Where'd you come from anyway? Where do you keep your sheep? I've never noticed your sheep on the hills here. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest, and thou makest thy flock to rest at noon. For why should I be as one that turneth aside by the flocks of thy companions?" One that turneth aside in the Hebrew actually means one who is veiled. And it probably refers to a prostitute, although not only prostitutes wore veils. We do know that Tamar, when she disguised herself as a prostitute by the side of the road, put on a veil and seduced Judah that way. But when she says, "Why should I be as one that is veiled among thy companions?" what she probably means is, why don't you just tell me where I can find you so I don't have to go to the other shepherds and ask about you? I feel kind of rude. I feel kind of froward, you're going up to the other men and asking them things. That's like a prostitute going up to men, and women just don't approach men publicly and so forth. Why should I be like a prostitute? Why should I be bold like a woman going up and approaching these men to ask questions about you? And he answers her, apparently, in verse 8, "If thou know not, thou fairest among women, go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed thy kids beside the shepherd's tents." In other words, what? This is no very clear answer. Follow the sheep or something like that, and hang out near where the shepherds are. But it's kind of a mysterious answer. It doesn't give her any straight information, so that she still doesn't know where to find him. If we see this as something Jesus is saying to the church, by the way, we can see that if we desire to find him, we need to find him with his sheep. Go by the way of the sheep. We don't find Jesus apart from the church. In other words, we don't find the head without the body. Many people say, "Well, I can be a good Christian and not go to church," and maybe they can be righteous in their doings and maybe have a devout life in some ways, but you can't have contact with Christ apart from his sheep. Jesus said, if it says in 1 John, anyone that says he loves God should love his brothers also. And so you do find Christ among his sheep. You don't find him alone only. People don't like the sheep, but they like Jesus. Here she says, "Where can I find you? Where do you feed your sheep?" And he says, "You follow the sheep, and there you'll find me." Then, I think in verses 9 through 5, or at least 9 through 14, we have a scene at the banqueting table in the chamber. In verse 4, she said, "He brought me into his chambers." Now they're at the wedding feast, and she's back to reality now. She's at the banqueting table sitting with her bridegroom. It's mentioned that he's brought her to his banqueting table. And it says, he speaks of her as they're sitting there during the festivities, and he looks at her and he says, "I've compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. Thy cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, thy neck with chains of gold," sort of like Mr. T. "We will make thee borders of gold and studs of silver." Now, he's got kind of a macho way of expressing, what he thinks about her. "I compare you to war horses pulling Pharaoh's chariot. Chariots. I compare you to war horses, pulling the chariots of Pharaoh." Sometimes he compares her to an armed tower with shields around it and so forth. He's kind of a macho kind of a character, and when he tries to think of things that are really beautiful to compare her to, he thinks of warlike images and things like that. He's a commander in chief of the armies of Israel, and so, those are the things that really turn him on. And so when he tries to compare her, he uses things that maybe, whether she could appreciate them or not, he's really saying, these are great things that I compare you with. She speaks, "While the king sitteth at his table, my spikenard sendeth forth the smell thereof." So she's aware of the strength of her perfume. "A bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night between my breasts. My beloved is unto me as a cluster of camphor in the vineyards of En-gedi." Now, in saying he's like a bundle of myrrh or a cluster of camphor, these were aromatic spices that were worn by a woman usually in a bundle hung by a ribbon around her neck, and they would hang down between her breasts, where out of sight, she'd wear her clothes over it, and they would just sort of serve as perfume. They'd send off an aroma to try to attract her lovers. But she's saying, he's like this camphor hanging here between my breasts. He's going to lie between my breasts all night long, looking forward to the wedding bed. Now, verse 15 and following, I would say there's evidence that the scene has changed again. It's probably the same day after the wedding festivities. They're out under the trees, trying to be alone, and it seems possible they're even consummating their marriage on that occasion, out sort of under the open sky in a meadow. And the reason I say that is because, well, I'll bring out the reasons as we go through. In verse 15 it says, the king again speaks, "Behold, thou art fair, my love." Here they are laying out on the grass, and he's saying these things to her. "Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes. Behold, thou art fair, my beloved, yea, pleasant. Also, our bed is green," so lying on the grass. "The beams of our house are cedar and rafters of fir." In other words, we're out in the woods, lying on the grass with these fir and cedar branches overhead, sort of like the beams of our wedding chamber. We're out kind of in nature, with the branches of these trees over our heads and the grass under our bodies. "And I am a rose of Sharon," she says, "and the lily of the valleys." Now, interestingly, Christians sometimes use the rose of Sharon or lily of the valleys as a picture of Christ. This is actually the woman speaking, not the man. And he speaks to her and says, "As a lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters." Now, in saying I'm a rose of Sharon or lily of the valleys, I'm not sure what she means, but apparently Sharon was a place that had a lot of roses, and lilies grew in great abundance in the valleys. She might simply be saying, I'm just another one of millions. I'm just another face in the crowd. I'm just one of the lilies in the valley. I'm just one of the roses of Sharon. There's so many others like me. And he says, no, there's no others like you. If you're a lily of the valley, you're a lily among thorns. All the others are not lilies at all. If you're a lily, they're just thorns, and by comparison. And then he goes on to describe her. She goes on to describe him, and she speaks in terms of him being like fruit. And I am convinced that this reference to her eating fruit and so forth is a picture, is her way of talking about making love. And the reason I say so is because she comes out of it plainly and says it in verse 6, "His left hand is under my head, his right hand doth embrace me." This is obviously a picture of them having a sexual encounter. I believe it's their wedding day after the festivities, and she describes it this way in verses 3 through 5. "As the apple tree among the trees of the wood," since they're in the woods, she kind of uses these figures, "so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house," and here I believe the banqueting house is banqueting on this fruit she's talking about, banqueting on love, eating love, not necessarily talking literally about in the actual feast. "His banner over me was love." Now, of course, you're familiar with that verse because it's been sung, but the essential thing she seems to be saying is, I've been banqueting on his love. He's overshadowed me. I'm laying down in his shadow, and his shadow is cast upon me while I banquet on all these sweet fruits of his love. "And stay me with flagons," better translation would be raisins. "Stay me with raisins, comfort me with apples, for I am sick or faint with love." Now, stay me with raisins and apples, and he's like an apple tree and so forth. I believe that this is like her comparing her body with a vineyard producing the wine that inebriates them. He produces fruit too. He's like apples. He's like raisins. This should not be understood literally, I believe. And so she closes this idyll by saying, "I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem." Apparently he's fallen asleep after they've had their time together. He's fallen asleep on the grass, and she says, "I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up, nor awake my love till he please." Now, when she says, "I charge you by the roes," which are the gazelles, and the hinds of the field, it seems apparent that these are the witnesses. When she says, "I charge you by this," it's like, swear to me by these things that you won't wake him until he's ready to wake up. And the picture is he's gone to sleep now, and the daughters of Jerusalem have come to attend to them, perhaps to escort them back to their house. And she says, "No, don't wake him. I charge you by these witnesses, these animals out here in the wilderness, that you don't wake him until he chooses." And she repeats this refrain 2 other times later on. Now we come to the second idyll, and we now are transported back in time from the date of the wedding that we've been looking at to just reminiscing about the courtship. And this is her speaking. The voice of my beloved, behold, he cometh leaping upon the mountains and skipping upon the hills. My beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he standeth behind our wall. He looketh forth at the windows, reminiscent of Romeo and Juliet, showing himself through the lattice. My beloved spake and said unto me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing of birds is come. The voice of the turtle, more properly the turtle dove, is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her figs, and the vines with their tender grape give us good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. Now, she's remembering how in the springtime, when the winter was past, the rainy season was over, the birds were singing, the flowers were appearing, the grapes in the vineyard that she was tending were ripening. It was the time of spring when young men's hearts turn to these kinds of things. He comes to her and says, Run away with me, let's go leaping on the hills, let's forget all this and go out and have a frolic. And so he says, O my dove, that art in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs, let me see thy countenance, let me hear thy voice, for sweet is thy voice, and thy countenance comely. Now, here she is remembering, I believe, the whole thing where he came and swept her off her feet, and it was springtime, and he says, Come away with me, I'll take you to better places than this. Then all of a sudden, now this is disputable, but verse 15, I believe, is interjected by her brothers. They indisputably speak in chapter 8, but here it's not certain. But some have made some spiritual application to verse 15, but it could be just basically, he says, Take us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for the vines have tender grapes. Here, this guy's trying to sweep her off her feet, and her brothers come along and say, Hey, lady, get back to work. The foxes have broken into the vineyard. We've got new grapes here. We've got to get them out. Chase them down. In other words, get back to work. No time for this romancing. And her brothers are very cold and practical. And they say, Come on, no more of this, romancing. Let's get back to work. The foxes are in the vineyard again. Let's get them out. And others have seen this as more of a symbolic thing, saying that the grapes represent the love between the couple, and then the foxes represent little things that come into the relationship that spoil the relationship and so forth. But I'm not as romantic as some interpreters, and I just see this as an abrupt intrusion by her brothers on the occasion when she was first desiring the man. Then she says, My beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies, probably meaning he feeds his sheep among the lilies, until the day break and the shadows flee away. Turn, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bether. And the thing continues in the next chapter. By night on my bed I sought him, whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. I will rise now and go about the city in the streets, and in the broad ways will I seek him, whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. The watchmen that go about the city found me, to whom I said, Saw ye him whom my soul loveth? It was but a little that I passed from them, but I found him, whom my soul loveth. I held him, and I would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, and into the chamber that had conceived me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up, nor awake my love till he please. Now, she may be talking about a dream here. It resembles very closely a later idyll, which I believe definitely is a dream, and that is in chapter 5 and verse 2, I sleep but my heart waketh. I believe it's talking about a dream, and there are some similarities between what she says here and that dream. There's a difference, though. In her dream of chapter 5, she doesn't find him. Here she does. And it doesn't say that this was a dream. It may have been a dream or it may not have been. If she literally did get up by night and go look for him, it may have been because in the daytime her brothers made her work and wouldn't let her take time out for sashaying around with this young, handsome shepherd guy who's trying to woo her, so she sneaks out at night to go and find him. And it would appear that when she found him, it says she wouldn't let him go until she brought him into the chamber of her that conceived me, that is, into my mother's chamber. Remember that when Isaac married Rebekah, it simply says he took her into his mother's tent, or took her into his tent, and they lived in the tent that had been his mother's before her death. Apparently, sometimes it was desirable, I guess, for a wedding to be consummated in the tent of the husband or the wife's parent. Now, when it says she wouldn't let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, it doesn't necessarily say that she did take him in on that night and make love with him that night. They were not married at this time, obviously. But on the other hand, they might have had sex before marriage. We don't. There are some places in the past in Song of Solomon that makes it sound like they might have, and Solomon was not the most righteous person in the Bible. In the Old Testament law, there was a little bit of lenience on something like that. If a man did sleep with a virgin and they were unmarried, the only thing the law required of them was that they get married. And so, I don't want to read more into it than is, but it almost sounds like she found him in the night and took him and they did something together. But it could also mean that when she laid hold of him, it was her intention never to let him go until they could be married, until they could consummate their love in her mother's tent. But that her intentions may not have been carried out because he disappeared from her life shortly after that. I won't try to conjecture whether or not they had sex before they were married. As I said, there are some things that sound like it could be taken that way, but it doesn't explicitly say so, so I won't suggest that they did necessarily. And so it ends with the same refrain. He is asleep at the end of this idyll also, and she doesn't want him to be awakened before he prefers to be awakened. The next idyll starts at verse 6 and goes on. Yes? I don't know, but here it sounds like it's the bride's mother's house that she's thinking of. In Isaac's case, it was his own mother's place. Of course, her mother's house was hundreds of miles away from where they were married. I don't know very much about the customs, and probably customs in the Middle East on those things change from time to time, or may have had flexibility, so I couldn't tell you. But it seems clear to me she's talking about she wants to take him into bed, and it would speak of her desire to marry him. At least I understand it that way. Now this next idyll goes on all the way up to chapter 5, verse 1, begins at chapter 3, verse 6, and this, I believe, is a picture of after he wooed her as a shepherd, he comes back as king and reveals himself to be the king, and this is where he actually proposes to her. It says, "Who is this that cometh out of the wilderness like the pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all powders of the merchant? Behold his bed, which is Solomon's. 80 valiant men are about it, of the valiant of Israel. They all hold swords, being experts in war. Every man hath his sword upon his thigh, because of fear in the night. King Solomon made himself a chariot of wood of Lebanon. He made the pillars thereof of silver, the bottom thereof of gold. The covering of it was purple, and the midst thereof was paved with love," or the NIV, I think, says engraved willingly, "by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O ye daughters of Zion, and behold King Solomon with the crown wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals, and in the day of the gladness of his heart." Now this says this is King Solomon in the day of his espousals. This is the day he's going to propose. This is the day he wants to become espoused to this girl. She says, "Who is this that's coming in all this regalia? Look at this, this elaborate chariot he made with pillars of silver and the bottoms made out of gold. He made this especially for this occasion, to take his bride back to Jerusalem in. He's got his bodyguard around him with swords, lest in the night someone attack him. He's coming in this way. He's got his bed with him, quite significant. Who is this?" she says. Suddenly, she squints to see what is this all about, and she recognizes then, of course, that it's this shepherd that she had been in love with. And chapter 4 continues that, "Behold, thou art fair, my love." He's speaking to her now. And this is where he proposes to her. "Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is as the flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Thy teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn." Now these kinds of things might not flatter a modern girl in the Western society, but he's using language she could appreciate. Newly shorn sheep are white. And that's what he's saying about her teeth. Her teeth are very white, not like dirty sheep that haven't been recently shorn, but right after they're shorn and they're still wet from washing, they're nice and white, and that's what your teeth are like. He says, "Whereof every one bears twins, and none is barren among them." Every one bears twins could be translated, every one of them has a twin or a corresponding one. No, she's not missing any teeth. In days before dentistry, you need to appreciate the fact that teeth rot. And probably a lot of people, including young people, had holes in their mouths and teeth that weren't very white and so forth. And he says, not this girl. All her teeth are there. Every one on the top jaw has a corresponding one on the bottom jaw. Everyone has its twin. They're all good and white. This girl's unusual. She's got all her teeth. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet. Thy speech is comely. Thy temples are like a piece of a pomegranate within thy locks. Probably referring to the redness of it because pomegranates are red. Thy neck is like a tower of David builded on an armory. Again, military images is what he thinks is really beautiful. Tower of David, whereon hang 1,000 bucklers and shields of mighty men. This tower with the shields of the conquered kings hanging on its outside as trophies. Her neck reminds him of that. Probably she had gold or brass circles hanging on a chain around her neck or something, which reminded him of shields of David hanging on a tower. Thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. Now, how her breasts could be said to be like roes that feed among the lilies is not certain, but at least they're twins. At least they're alike. That is in her favor. Until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. You like that, huh? All right. Thou art fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. Now, by the way, there's no spot in thee, of course, means she doesn't have any blemishes, but we're reminded of the fact that that's what Jesus is looking for in his bride. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says that he might purify to himself a glorious church without spot and without blemish. And so here the bridegroom sees a spotless bride as he comes to take her. So when Jesus comes to take his church, she will be spotless at that occasion. Apparently, he's got to wait a little while yet. Now he actually makes his proposition, or proposal. Verse 8, come with me from Lebanon, my spouse. Her home was in Lebanon. Look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shinar and Hermon, and from the lions' dens, and from the mountains of the leopards. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. In other words, one of your eyes can ravish me. In other words, you have two of them, which is tremendous. I mean, one would be enough. It doesn't take all that you have. You could be less than you are and would totally overwhelm me, he's saying. But, I mean, even just one of your eyes would be enough. But you've got two. I mean, you've got more than what it would take to utterly overwhelm me with, and to attract me. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thy ointments than all spices. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue. And the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. A garden enclosed is my sister. Now, she compared herself to a vineyard. Here he compares her to a garden. Enclosed, meaning one that has never been penetrated. She was a virgin, apparently, at this point, or at least no other men had ever had her. She was sealed up for him. A garden encloses my sister, my spouse. He changes the image a little. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Solomon used the same kind of language for sexual activity in Proverbs 5. He talked to his son about not dispersing the fountains of waters in the streets, but to rejoice in the wife of his youth and to let his fountain be blessed with his wife. The fountain referring to his sexual relationships. He said, don't let it be in the streets. Don't go out with all the prostitutes, but just let your fountain be blessed with your wife. The same author here uses the expression, speaking of this girl's sexual life. She's like a spring or a fountain that's sealed. That is, she's a virgin. She's not allowed the fountain to spring forth with anyone yet. Thy plants are an orchard of pomegranates with pleasant fruits, camphor with spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, with all the chief spices, a fountain of gardens, a well of living waters, streams from Lebanon. Now, she hears all this, and basically, she figures this is a proposal, and so she says, awake, O north wind, And come thou south, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. In other words, I accept. You call me a garden sealed up. Okay, let the winds now blow the aroma of my garden your direction and attract you, and you come on into the garden now. You can have me, and you eat the pleasant fruits. And so he answers her in chapter 5, verse 1, I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse, which could imply that they already had these relationships, and yet the earlier verses indicate she's still a virgin. So he might be just saying, okay, this is it. I take you. I come into the garden, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Then apparently the bridesmaids speak up here. Eat, O friends, meaning the groom and the bride. Eat and drink. Yea, drink abundantly, O beloved. Now, if you're going to eat the fruit, go for it. They're encouraged by their companions. They receive the approval of their friends. Okay. The fourth idyll then here begins. And this is her troubled dream, which probably looks back at the time when she had been in love with the shepherd. Then he's out of her life. She doesn't know where he's gone. She doesn't know why he's gone. She dreams that he's come to her door, and she was too reluctant to come, and then she missed her opportunity. Snooze, you lose. She goes looking for him, can't find him. She gets abused by the people that she inquires of. It's just a dreadful situation, but it seems to be only a dream. In verse 2, I sleep, but my heart waketh. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh, saying, Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled, for my head is filled with dew, and my locks with the drops of the night. Now that I've come in from outdoors, I'm covered with dew. I'd like to come inside into your bedroom, is what he's saying. I have put on my coat, she said. How shall I put it on? I have washed my feet. How shall I defile them? I don't want to get dirty again. I washed my feet, and they're drawn up nice and cozy in the bed. You want me to get up and get them dirty and walk to the door? Then she says, My beloved put his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels were moved for him. Now, when she saw him trying to open the door, saw his hand through the hole, she changed her mind. She couldn't resist him. So she says, I rose up to open to my beloved, and my hands dropped with myrrh. She took a few moments to dip her hands in the myrrh before she got to the door. And my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh upon the handles of the lock. That took her a little while, I guess, to perfume herself on her way to the door. And by that time he was gone. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had withdrawn himself and was gone. My soul failed when he spoke. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. The watchmen that went about the city found me. They smote me. They wounded me. The keepers of the walls took away my veil from me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if ye find my beloved, that ye tell him that I am sick or faint with love. Now, this would be an interesting type, perhaps, or at least there's a lesson that can be seen of it. In Christ's absence between his first and second coming, of course, we long for him. We long for his appearing. And as we seem obsessed with our pursuit of him, with our discipleship, with our making him the whole object of our desire and of our pursuit, the watchmen of the city, those others who can't relate, they just treat us abusively, maybe. I mean, I haven't been subject to much abuse, but Christians have been. And people just can't relate to what this obsession is with Christ. And the people, that found her just kind of treat her badly and mock her and abuse her. And so she's persecuted because of her pursuit after her lover. And then verse 9 it says, and probably the daughters of Jerusalem are speaking, What is thy beloved more than another beloved, O fairest among women? What is thy beloved more than another beloved, that thou dost so charge us? Now she says, O you daughters of Jerusalem, if you find him, tell him I'm looking for him. And they say, well, why are you telling us? What's so great about this guy? Why are you so obsessed? They ask. And then she answers, My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. His head is as the most fine gold. His locks are bushy, and black as raven. His eyes are as the eyes of doves by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are as a bed of spices, as sweet flowers, his lips like lilies, dropping sweet-smelling myrrh. His hands are as gold rings set with the beryl. His belly is as bright ivory overlaid with sapphires. His legs are as pillars of marble, set upon sockets of fine gold. His countenance is as Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. His mouth is most sweet, yea, he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O ye daughters of Jerusalem. You ask why he's so different? Let me tell you what's so different about him. He's different. I mean, he's got legs like pillars. I mean, he's got hair like black as a raven and bushy locks, and man, you never seen a guy who's a hunk like this. And so then it goes on. They ask her then, whither is thy beloved gone, O thou fairest among women? Whither is thy beloved turned aside, that we may see him with thee? Hey, we'd like to catch a glimpse of this guy. They say, my beloved is gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed in the gardens and to gather the lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved's is mine. He feedeth among the lilies. Now, she can't find him, but she takes comfort in the fact that he's still feeding his flocks, and that she still belongs to him, even though he's not with her and she doesn't know where to find him. She's certain that she still belongs to him, and he belongs to her, and she figures he's just gone about his business feeding his sheep, which is an interesting parallel to our case with Christ. Yes? Yeah, I think, in a sense, I think they just kind of are the bystanders. They're neither the church nor, they're not the church. She's the church. Christ is the bridegroom, and these are kind of the bystanders who interject their questions and their thoughts and so forth. Sometimes favorable, sometimes not. Well, at the wedding, the bridesmaids are there, right? They probably are, but what I would say is that they're not to be connected with any particular group of people. They are stage scenery, is what they are. They're in ancient dramas, including later ones, the Greek dramas and Roman dramas. There were these choruses that would just kind of come on and sing a few things like introducing a new scene or carrying the story forward somehow. And they don't necessarily have to represent anyone in the story. They just they give the bride an opportunity by asking questions to say what she wants to say. What's he like? Well, let me tell you. And that's how I understand it. I suppose you could see them as something else, but I don't attach any particular parallel to them with anyone in the world particularly. Though the watchmen are definitely characters in the drama. I mean, they abuse the girl and so forth. I would say they would tend to be the people of the world who don't relate and don't appreciate her quest for her bridegroom. But the bridesmaids seem to be mainly scenery, I think. Okay, then the fifth idyll begins at verse 4, and it runs through the next chapter, verse 10. Okay, and this is Solomon's meditation on his bride. We've heard a lot about what she thinks of him. Now he tells us what he thinks of her. Thou art beautiful, O my love, as Tirzah, comely as Jerusalem, terrible as an army with banners. Still military all the way. Now, by the way, Tirzah was the first capital of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem obviously was the capital of the southern kingdom. In Solomon's day, there were not two kingdoms, but these cities existed as separate cities, and Tirzah, the name of the city Tirzah, means beautiful. So it was probably named that because it was beautiful. It must have been a beautiful city for them to have given it that name. It was the original capital of Jeroboam. Later, Omri moved the capital of the northern kingdom to Samaria. But in the days of Solomon, Tirzah was a notable, beautiful city, and so was Jerusalem. And he says, you're like these beautiful cities. Now, to compare a woman with cities is not too strange. The city of Jerusalem and the city of Samaria are continually spoken of in forms of a woman in the prophets, usually spoken of as unfaithful women because of the way they relate to God. But to compare the cities of Jerusalem and others and Babylon to women is found even in the book of Revelation. It's a common metaphor, a common figure of speech. Here he's speaking of some very beautiful cities and saying that this woman reminds him of the beauty of those cities, and she's terrible as an army with banners, implying that she's very impressive. I don't know what else to say about that. Of course, looking at the church this way, we could say that God views the church as an army, an army in the earth, and very impressive.
And chapter 6, verse 1, where the children of Israel, where is thy love? Where is God? I take it to people of the world who don't believe in Christ, who don't think that this man is coming back. He said he's coming back, but where is he? He's got all this sickness, he's got all these kids trying to solve the issue. Well, where is he?
Yeah.
That's the way I see it.
And she says, well, he's going about his business. In the meantime, I belong to him and he belongs to me. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an interesting insight. Okay. We're really low on time and have some chapters yet to cover. Let's keep going here. So he's talking about her. He says in verse 5, turn away thine eyes from me, for they have overcome me. He says, oh, don't look at me. I just kind of faint when I see you. Thy hair is as a flock of goats. They appear from Gilead. Thy teeth are as a flock of sheep which go up from the washing. Therefore every one beareth twins, or has its twin. There is not one barren among them. Again, no teeth missing. As a piece of a pomegranate are thy temples within thy locks. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines, and virgins without number, but my dove, my undefiled, is but one. And you stand out among them all. There's women galore. I've got 60 wives. I've got 80 concubines. And as far as the virgins who are not yet committed to anyone, I could take any of my one. Innumerable number. And he eventually took 1,000 of them, so he proved his words. But he said, despite the multitude of women available to me, there's only one like you. You stand out. I wonder if he said that to all the girls. But anyway, I think he was sincere in this case. He was quite. He saw her as the apple of his eye here. It says, she is the only one of her mother. She is the choice one of her that bare her. The daughters saw her and blessed her. Yea, the queens and the concubines, and they praised her. I wonder if they praised her sincerely. Oh, here comes another queen to the harem, more beautiful than us. They had to praise her. They were required to, but who knows? Maybe she just really impressed everybody. It's possible. But it says she's the only one of her mother. It just shows that, she's one of a kind. Some of you men, no doubt, having met somebody's wife who's a very gracious and lovely woman, you think, boy, I wish I could find a wife like that when you were single. Have you ever asked a married woman if she had a sister? I've known that to happen many times. People ask a married woman, do you have any sisters? Because well, she's spoken for. She's not available, but maybe there's someone else. Maybe her parents produced another one somewhere. And he's saying there aren't any more like this one. She doesn't have any sisters. She's one of a kind, and there's no one going to have anything like her but me. Then the king says, who is she that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners? She speaks, I went down to the garden of nuts. Actually, here I think she is remembering the first time she met him, when she was intimidated, when he first showed up and when he first saw her for the first time. He's remembering this, and he's remembering how she was and so forth. Her speaking, I went down to the garden of nuts to see the fruits of the valley, and to see whether the vine flourished, and the pomegranates budded. Or ever I was aware, my soul made me like the chariots of Aminadab. Now she says, I was just down minding my business, checking out the vines like I'm supposed to do. I'm the vine keeper. So I'm down there looking at the vines, and what do you know? First thing I know, I'm running like a chariot the opposite direction. What happened? Before I even knew what was happening, I find myself fleeing like a speeding chariot. And Solomon's calling after her, return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon thee. He doesn't want her to run away. He wants to get a better look. But she says, what will ye see in the Shulamite? As it were the company of two armies. That's not a very good translation. As it were the company of two armies. Of two armies is one word in the Hebrew, Mahanaim, which can mean two bands or two companies or two armies. But Mahanaim, actually this whole expression in the last part of verse 13, could we say, as it were the dance of two companies, or the dance of Mahanaim. And it's probably speaking of the fact that the Jews used to get together and band into two rows. Did you ever see Fiddler on the Roof? You know how in the bar there where they danced, the two groups of men, it wasn't even a dance between men and women, it's just recreational dancing. where they just kind of have fun together, and they get into two lines, and they'd kind of dance around and so forth. Well, that was probably more Russian than Jewish dancing in that movie. But the Jews would have these kinds of dancing where they get into two companies. It wouldn't necessarily be women and men together, but it would be more for recreation and entertainment. And she says, "What do? You want to watch? You want to look at me like you watch these two companies dancing? In other words, are you going to make sport of me, or you just want to watch me to bring you some kind of a lecherous pleasure or something?" And she was not going to come back on that occasion. He didn't win her that first time. He saw her. He wanted to get a better look, but she was afraid. She was running away. And so he continues his musing in chapter 7. "How beautiful are thy feet with shoes, O prince's daughter! The joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of thy hands of a cunning workman. Thy navel is like a round goblet, which does not lack liquor." Whether he ever actually drank out of her navel is not ever recorded, but it sounds like maybe he did. "Thy belly is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies." Now, to say that to your girlfriend that her belly is like a heap of wheat, some of you men go back and tell your wife that and see what she says. Realize that the obsession with thinness is a fairly modern and Western obsession. In classical Greek and earlier times, a woman was considered desirable if she was fat, substantial. Now, it's a strange thing to us because our tastes are usually quite different in these modern times. But realize that this woman may have been quite plump, and that might have been part of the attractiveness of her. She doesn't appear to have been, like the modern fashion models. She had a belly like a heap of wheat. And then he tells us more about her breasts. They're like two young roes that are twins. "Thy neck is as a tower of ivory, thine eyes like the fish pools of Heshbon, by the gates of Bath Rabbim. Thy nose is like a tower," very kosher, "of Lebanon, which looketh toward Damascus. Thine head upon thee is like Carmel, and the hair of thine head is like purple." Not that it is really purple in color, but that it is like purple cloth. Purple cloth was very expensive cloth, and he's saying that her hair flowed like this fine cloth, probably purple silk is what is in mind. But he's not saying her hair was purple in color, but it's like this cloth, this expensive purple cloth, and its probably texture and the way it falls. "The king is held in the galleries. How fair and how pleasant art thou, O love, for delights! This thy stature is like to a palm tree, thy breasts to clusters of grapes. I said, I will go up to the palm tree, I will take hold of the boughs thereof. Now also thy breasts shall be as clusters of the vine, and the smell of thy nose like apples. And the roof of thy mouth like the best wine, for my beloved that goeth down sweetly causeth the lips of those that are asleep to speak." He doesn't leave much to the imagination here as far as what he's talking about. And she gets the impression he likes her. She says, "I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me." Having heard him say those things, she says, "I think he kind of likes me." Okay, next idyll, the 6th, is short, from verse 11 to chapter 8, verse 4, and it ends with that other, "I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you stir not, nor wake my love till he please." So that's where that one ends. It's short. She, in this case, is talking about her homesickness for her homeland in Lebanon. "Come, my beloved, let us go forth to the field," she says to him. "Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine flourish, whether the tender grape appear, and the pomegranates bud forth. There will I give thee my loves. The mandrakes give a smell, and at our gates are all manner of pleasant fruits, new and old, which I have laid up for thee, O my beloved. Oh, that thou wert as my brother, that sucked the breast of my mother. When I should find thee without, I should kiss thee, yea, I would not be despised." In other words, she could publicly show affection to her brothers without anyone thinking that was wrong. She says, "I wish I could publicly express my affection to you without being despised by people, as I could with my brothers. Wish you were like one of them. Then I could just lavish my affection on you publicly without concerns about what people would think. I would lead thee and bring thee into my mother's house, who would instruct me. I would cause thee to drink the spiced wine and the juice of the pomegranate. His left hand should be under my head, his right hand should embrace me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that ye stir not up, nor awake my love till he please. Now she's asking him if they could go back to the vineyards, back to smell the smells of the pastoral life, which was her place of origin. Now the last idyll here, we have them going to Lebanon, to the vineyard again, and there they renew their vows. She makes reference to her jealousy as the reason that she wants him to renew his love to her. Verse 5, who is this that cometh up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? These are of course, the daughters of Jerusalem saying, here they are, they're seeing the woman leaning on the shoulder of Solomon as they walk up through the wilderness up to where the vineyard is. He says, I raised thee up under the apple tree. There thy mother brought thee forth. There she brought thee forth that bare thee. In other words, we're back to the place where you were born. Then she says, set me as the seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave, the coals thereof as coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be condemned, not contemned or despised. She says essentially, I'm jealous. And jealousy is like a coal burning inside me. My love for you makes me jealous over you. And you can't quench this fire of love and jealousy in me by waters. You know, how can you quench jealousy? You can't put it out. Suppose you would give me all riches in the world and say, well, this proves my love. I don't want riches. I want you, she's saying. You know, if someone would want to give you all kinds of substance of his house in exchange for love, it would be considered not worth it. She's essentially saying, I value your love more than your gifts. I mean, she's a queen. She probably has all kinds of gifts that he gives her, but she's not sure that means he really loves her. And she says, don't give me money. Give me assurance that you still love me, because I'm kind of burning up with this jealousy. And then I believe, and I don't see any other way of seeing this, in verses 8 through 10, she at this point remembers how that when she was young and underdeveloped, she probably was a late bloomer with respect to her physical development, that her brothers were concerned because they would have, brothers played a very important role in the finding of a wife for or of a husband for their sister. And they were concerned about it because she was a late bloomer. She didn't have any breasts, they say. And she used to be kind of confused about overhearing them talk like this. But now she understands, now that she's fully developed, and it says, her brothers are speaking here, we have a little sister, and she has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister in the day when she shall be spoken for? If she be a wall, we will build upon her a palace of silver. If she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. Now what it apparently means is that we'll have to adorn her. She doesn't really have any breasts yet, so we'll just ornament her. We'll have to use other things to make her attractive. She's flat like a wall, but we'll just we'll surround her with ornaments and so forth to make her attractive. But now she says in verse 10, I am a wall, and my breasts are like towers. Then was I in his eyes as one that found favor. So she's kind of probably remembering the irony of how her brothers once thought she's going to have trouble finding a husband. She's underdeveloped. But now that she's in full bloom and she's marrying the mightiest man in the world, she says, isn't that interesting? My brothers once thought like this about me, and now look where I am. Solomon had a vineyard in Baal-Hamon. And he let out the vineyard unto keepers. Every one for the fruit thereof was to bring 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, which is mine, is before me. Thou, O Solomon, must have 1,000, and those that keep the fruit thereof 200. Now, she just says, just as Solomon hired people to keep his many vineyards, so my vineyard, meaning her body, which is mine, she says, is yours. Solomon, you have the owner's share. You get the 1,000. I'm giving you the owner's share of my vineyard, is what she's saying. Now, the 200, I don't know what it refers to tell you the truth, but she's essentially saying just as the people who keep the fruit for Solomon in his vineyards have to give him his share, which is 1,000 pieces of silver, which is what he expects them to produce. They get to keep the rest. So she says, I'm giving you 1,000 of my vineyard, implying that what belongs to the owner. You're the owner of me. Now, apparently in verse 13, he hears the escort approaching. They've had a little bit of privacy now, but their time of privacy is over. The escort is approaching. He hears their voice. He says, Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice. Cause me to hear it. That is to say, the companions, our escort, they're coming. They can hear us talking. They hear our voice. Let me hear your voice. And she says, apparently, Make haste, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or to a young hart upon the mountains of spices. Now, I don't have much more to say about this, except that if we do see this as a picture of Christ in the church, which is a kind of a classic way of viewing it, that all this description of sexual love and the way that these two are so enamored with each other is a picture of course, the intensity of our love for Jesus. And she says, your love is better than wine. Our love for Jesus should be overwhelming. And in fact, of course, we're to be not drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. On the day of Pentecost, when they were filled with the Spirit, they were accused of being drunk with wine, but it was really just the Spirit who birthed in them the fruit of the Spirit, which is love. Their love for Jesus made them act silly. Paul said we are fools for Christ. And so, the things that we read here, I mean, you almost feel embarrassed reading about this because you feel like you're looking into someone's private bedchamber, while they're making love, and you feel like, well, I really don't think I belong here. But when you realize this is just supposed to be showing you how lovers are, and how the church is to be toward Christ, and how Christ adores His church and lavishes His love upon her, then it sort of removes it from what would be thought kind of a base or a low or a carnal place to realizing that it's talking really about the spiritual relationship and love between us and Christ, the bridegroom. And of course, if the story is as I've suggested, then it's a very interesting picture that speaks of how Jesus wooed us in His humble manner, but will come for us again to take His bride in all His splendor.